This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country and join their calls for justice. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Hello and welcome to a special bonus Patreon episode of Serious Danger, a podcast about green politics in Australia, but most importantly, not an official Greens Party podcast. But you probably already know that. If you're listening, thank you for being a Patreon subscriber. Of course, as always, I'm Emerald Moon. Michael the Griffin is our faithful producer. And today I'm joined actually by a special guest, not Tom. Tom's still away. I'm joined by a special guest to discuss Australia's mental health care system, why it's cooked and how to fix it. So I'm joined by Jocelyn Brewer, who is a psychologist with expertise in cyber psychology and digital wellbeing. Also happens to have been the Greens candidate for the South Sydney seat of Watson in the 2025 federal election. Thanks for joining me, Jocelyn.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Extremely exciting. So, I mean, probably a few people listening will remember we did a call out maybe a few weeks ago for people's thoughts on the mental health care system in Australia. And first off, thank you to everyone who responded. I was a little bit overwhelmed, honestly, with the responses. There were so many. Of course, I should have known. There's so many counsellors, mental health professionals, psychologists, etc., in the Greens orbit and the Serious Danger listener universe. I'm sorry I wasn't able to respond to everyone, but everything that everyone sent in was really helpful, and multiple people did suggest speaking to you, Jocelyn.
Oh,
so I think that
nice.
this is going to be a good chat.
Yeah, hopefully. Yes. Let's do it.
Now, I'm sure that it's never easy to do the 30-second summary, but can you give us a bit of a snapshot on where your perspective on mental health comes from, and psychological care, where that comes from?
Yeah, absolutely. So I became a psychologist through the New South Wales School Counsellor Retraining Program. So I was a high school teacher. I'd actually worked at Centrelink on the front desk and thought, gee, I really want to make a bigger difference. So I ended up becoming a teacher and then a psychologist. And through that process, my fourth year honours thesis was actually about boys and video games. And that's kind of where it took me with the cyber psychology stuff. So I ended up writing a master's thesis in cyber psychology, finally finished it a couple of years ago. But I guess generally, I work in a suburban private practice. I'm a solo private practitioner. And I probably often work unknowingly with Greens voters or adjacent kind of folks. So I have some experience with neuroaffirming practice, with gender affirming practice. I'm a member of Psychology for a Safe Climate, and I will soon be a climate cafe facilitator. So coming through, I guess, youth mental health and schools was really my training ground. And here we are, it's now 16 years later, which is kind of scary because I still only feel like I'm about 32.
Yeah. I feel like I'm at that point where, I'm already still stuck about 5 years ago, and that's probably just going to be the case for the rest of my life. But yes, sounds like you've got a whole lot of experience, and particularly the experience in the youth mental health stuff, I think is interesting because I kind of came at this from a very not having any professional expertise or I'm not an expert in any way in the mental health care system. I've had various interactions with it over my lifetime, but I just felt like for some time that it's not set up to work. And I'd heard stuff, particularly about Headspace. And I was talking to a lot of people who messaged us about Headspace. And I just wanted to dig into that feeling. So it's a fairly broad ranging chat. We'll see how we go, just talking about anything and everything mental health care. But I guess, yes, shall we get into it?
Yes, please.
Let's do it. All right. So the Productivity Commission is in the process of reviewing Australia's National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Agreement. And last month it released an interim report saying it's not fit for purpose and should be basically scrapped and rewritten with tangible commitments from government bodies. One of the things that I was curious about is it's not the first review of the mental health system that's been like, hey, this is fucked. Here are all the things that you need to do to fix it. Why do you think we have so many of these reviews which come up with these great recommendations around the mental health care system that ultimately fail to eventuate into much substantial change?
A few things in terms of one is just straight up priorities and funding. When we look at Labor in the last at the last election, offered $1 billion towards mental health initiatives. In fact, expanding our friends at Headspace and calling it Headspace Plus.
Oh,
But then there's yeah. So, and we can get onto what that does, I guess, later.
yeah.
But
Okay.
when we
Yeah.
compare $1 billion to 365 billion, was it, for some submarines, that gives you a bit of a perspective in terms of one kind of spending around, defense versus the total value of looking at mental health. We then have the layers within the state health system and then the federal health system. So not only do we have productivity commissions, we've got all of the different other departments that want to have a stake in mental health, and then within state governments, we've had like a big review, layers upon layers of like the same recommendations saying the same sort of things. And often it's about fragmentation. Often it's about, we haven't actually stopped to ask people with lived experience of the system how they think that we should do things better.
Yeah.
So I think it's really, really easy to ask questions and do all of these reviews. It's really hard to coordinate effective responses. And again, we might think about, interventions in the Northern Territory and closing the gap and those sorts of things. Sometimes we go, why is this not working? Like, why is there still this slow glacial change of progress when sometimes it looks quite straightforward, like give Indigenous people a voice to Parliament?
Yeah, well, we tried that. Remember, everyone said no, done now, and now we don't need to listen to First
Yeah.
Nations people at all. I think that's what we decided from that process if we're in the government. But yeah, I mean, definitely fragmentation is like one of those things that seems to be a big problem, as with all health funding, right? Like this is the problem when you've got multiple levels of government involved, and also then you're trying to fund such a broad range of different things under that mental health banner. Then you've got like alcohol and other drugs funding, you've got eating disorders, you've got chronic mental health conditions, and like it's a
Yeah.
I mean, I don't envy a government trying to solve the
Yeah.
problem, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that spectrum of mental health and mental illness is really part of that conversation. Some people would call the DSM actually just the book of trauma. So that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And many of these things actually just sort of come back to levels of trauma, both big T trauma or little t trauma. And we give different names to different observations of behavior based on how that trauma shows up, maybe in your body, maybe in your brain, maybe in your mood. And I think when and again, I think we'll get onto this, when we look at society and we look at what we're dealing with on a daily basis and compare that to our ancestors from just like a couple of generations ago, there's good reason that we are not feeling happy about, our lives and the world around us and our communities that seem to have been,
Yeah.
chopped into shreds.
Yes. Well, and maybe addressing some of those things, whether it's, housing affordability, etc., is much harder than just pouring money into one particular bucket, which is where I get to this headspace
Yeah.
question. Like, shout out to also, I have to say, so Joe Van Twest Farmer was one person who gave heaps of insight in response to our call out for submissions. So thank you to Joe. And one of the things that Joe was saying was that governments love reviews and they love strategies, but they hate action. But I think the other thing that governments love doing is giving money to Headspace. And like, I'd never really thought about this too much until my psychologist, who I was seeing a few years ago, said just this kind of throwaway remark where she was like, oh, I shouldn't say this, but governments, they're just giving a bunch of money to Headspace and it doesn't work. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I looked into it and saw that there's been so many criticisms of Headspace over the years. What do you think of those, criticisms of Headspace?
Yeah, I think Headspace was set up to really address mild mental health conditions, the sorts of things that you would get a mental health care plan for. And so really it's a bulk billing psychology service, except it costs the taxpayer far more than if you were to see me or another psychologist at a bulk billing rate. So I think
Mm.
one of the issues too, and it duplicates a lot of the work that school counsellors and school psychologists might be doing, in that we often triage and we often then look for, is there suicidality or risk of self-harm? And if you're at Headspace and you mention either of those things, you probably will not continue getting services and be referred on. So
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
needs to, I guess, be, again, that continuum of care that looks at what is the presenting problem, what is the workforce who actually is at Headspace able to do, and what are the referral pathways for all of those different, I guess, ways that mental illness can progress. So,
Mm.
like, I don't want to kind of it be a like rat on Headspace sort of situation, because folks who work there do an incredible job and it does capture a lot of young people. I guess when young people have such an incredible awareness of their own mental health, the way they speak to me about mental health is phenomenal. Like as a trainee psychologist, I probably didn't have some of the awareness that kids come to me with.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we really need to recognize their mental health literacy and the work of all of the awareness building that we've done. And we've probably seen those memes. I have too much awareness, like enough with the awareness building.
Yes.
We really need the skills and the support and the action. And again, young people are often peer-to-peer supporting one another. A lot of young people who I work with who do have digital kind of problematic use of their various screens, sometimes staying up and keeping a phone by their side because they are being the mental health service for their friends. And even though there's kids
Yeah.
helpline and even though there's a range of support services, they're often like, yeah, but my friends might need me and I need to be there for them from that perspective.
Yes. Yeah.
So often we don't talk enough to young people, and certainly young people with lived experience. I'm really lucky a lot of my work is in those spaces. So I have a role within Project Rocket. At the moment, I'm working on a sleep project where I'm like the research assistant to young people. They come to me and say,
Hmm.
hey, Joss, how do we do this thing? And I give them some advice, but it's driven by what they need, not what I think they need. And that's a really kind of quick example, I guess, of the way that we could redesign services so that it actually was fit for purpose.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yes, there is like a lot of people say there is a place for Headspace as just kind of like that triage service, the drop in service that it was kind of designed for. But it then becomes maybe that's the only place that a lot of people can access, but it's not enough for what they need. And you see like there have been multiple research papers over the last decade or so. It was established in 2006, Headspace. So I guess that's almost 2 decades, but
Mm,
that say there's very little clinically significant improvement from people who visit Headspace.
yeah.
And the other problem is that the Goldilocks zone, which I had to look up what this was when someone raised it with me. Can you explain what the Goldilocks zone issue is?
Yeah, it's basically having enough features of a mental health condition to meet criteria, but not too many that you become too complex for the service. So,
Okay.
like what I was saying before, like you want to kind of have some general garden variety. Anxiety and depression, but in terms of psychosis or complexity around maybe eating disorder, emerging
Mm,
personality disorders, those kinds of more what we might think of as psychiatric or real mental illnesses.
mhm,
Headspace generally, again, will refer on. And there's some research, I think, that points to when you link in then with your child and adolescent mental health service, which have traditionally been like the public health service where you would kind of go to for that bulk billing role, when you're linked into that and they can provide that higher level, that can have positive outcomes, because we do want to have spaces. And again, that cafe idea of come in and destigmatize actually
mhm.
getting help. So that can be
Yeah.
really great. Those centers, are fun and full of, free condoms and tampons and all the things that get kids in. But then when it gets to those more complex referral pathways, it has kind of been seen to fall down a little bit. And I guess that's where this new Headspace Plus initiative is designed to then pick up the next level of complexity and more
Ah,
significant mental health
okay.
concerns.
Yeah, interesting. So, yeah, maybe can you explain what that is? Because this is, I think, the critique from a lot of people is the government just is like, yeah, we're doing something on mental health. Here's another billion, here's another multiple $1 billion announcement
Yeah.
for Headspace. And it's like, okay, so is this different?
Well, it's different in that it's hopefully going to capture a bunch more of the more complex clientele. They haven't been rolled out yet. They've only been announced. So in my electorate of
Okay.
Watson, Bankstown was announced. You can imagine here we have a huge non-English speaking and also refugee population, a lot of trauma in the community. The other thing about Headspace is we need culturally informed practices as well. So it's not enough necessarily for me as a cis white woman, who grew up, down the road. We young people really want to see and be treated sometimes by practitioners, not only have cultural awareness, but actually replicate that. And again, there's
Yeah.
great programs around here. I'd give a shout out to Ziad at the Shifa project, who's doing incredible work. He's run Educate and all of these he was a high school teacher too, so lots of people who come through working with young people, develop some really innovative systems that he now gets, contracts back into health, primary health networks to deliver things that they simply, don't offer and don't have the capacity and the skills to offer. So again,
Yeah.
another little
Yeah.
example.
Yeah, I had another question actually about Headspace that I didn't realize even though it's a government sort of program, it is run by private contractors. Is that right?
Yeah, it's tendered out. So, I could decide I want to run a Headspace and put in a tender.
Mm,
Often they're not for profit sort of organizations, benevolent society, and things like that, I think have
okay.
been known to tender. But in effect, they run the tender, they run the center. You have to set the center up, and then you're in effect bulk billing. So the cost and why it's so
Yeah.
expensive isn't necessarily of just bulk billing. And again, there would be some different ways that you could pay people like me to bulk bill, not at the bulk billing rate,
Mm,
because psychologists generally can't afford to work for that unless
yeah.
you are in a bigger practice where you have a lot of costs absorbed.
Mm,
And the role of AI in my note taking is the way that I haven't actually put my fees up in the last 2 years. I just keep finding ways to be
interesting.
more productive in order to help people be able to afford a private billing service.
Yeah. I want to come back to that, to the
Mhm.
AI thing, because that's interesting.
Okay.
But quickly, before we get off Headspace,
Mhm.
did you know about this? Is the other thing, thanks
Mm.
to Juzzy, who wrote in about this, that apparently Headspace has links to the state of Israel in terms of like some of its key founding
Yeah,
people.
I think that, links to the state of Israel are everywhere in all
Yeah, that's
industries.
true. Yeah.
And, when there is a new and innovative model, often people want to replicate it. So we see that even with the e-safety
Mm,
office. Our e-safety office is first of its kind, and lots of places around the world come to us say, hey, how do we start this in Fiji or, the UK and things like
mm.
that. So, yes, we I guess have our BDS hats on and be looking for those links and thinking about some of those connections almost in
Yeah.
every area of our life, which can be exhausting but also
Yeah.
very rewarding.
It is exhausting, but yes, I did think it was. I mean, it was helpful to know, and this is we can put the link in the show notes. It was Matt Chun that published an article on his Substack in collaboration with Mental Health Workers for Palestine and laid out. So Headspace has one other location outside of Australia, and that's in Israel. It's funded by Zionist organizations there, offers free services to Israeli settlers, but not Palestinians. So I thought that was just helpful to know. Always good to know.
Mm.
And also that they've done, like, it's the same people who kind of set up the Are You OK Day, which obviously people have various criticisms of, but brought that
Mhm.
to Israel. So thinking about, though, the people who set up Headspace, two or one of the other architects of Headspace, Ian Hickey, and that name, as well as Pat McGorry,
Mhm.
came up multiple times in the responses that people sent us thinking about like what's wrong with mental health care in Australia. So who are Ian Hickey and Pat McGorry, and what influence do they have on mental health policy in Australia?
Yeah, it's kind of like a duopoly, and
Mm.
they're I don't how am I going to answer this one? So, like, full disclosure, I have met both of them. I have introduced them at conferences. They
Mhm.
do like incredible work. Again, I don't want to detract from the work that they do.
Okay.
However, it is a bit of a duopoly, I guess. When you think about the
Mm.
names in mental health in Australia, you think of these two um, older white male psychiatrists and
Yeah.
psychiatrists who've trained in a model of psychiatry, which was the disease model and the disorder model. And
Mm.
there are lots of criticisms of them, Hickey in particular, for links to the pharmaceutical industry. And, you know, again, you'd have to kind of, you could write a whole thesis on this, digging into historical benefit, how they've historically been beneficiaries of different pharma companies. And we know that, like,
Mm.
again, it's like I've done work for Meta. I've done work for some of the big tech firms, but not to the degree they own me or I would change their opinion on their products or, you know, any of that kind of
Sure.
thing. So
Yeah.
I think we have to acknowledge two things can be true. They've made money through working with
Yeah.
pharmaceutical companies, and they can also do non-biased work. And I'll
Yeah.
let people go and dig into that if they want to explore the depths. But
Yeah. Okay.
generally, like they're the go-to dudes, right? And they've just worked and advocated and lobbied and been very, very active. And you know, like I watched their advocacy, and I think, gosh, I wish I could bring that to the Bankstown Greens. When we have a
What
little bit of that, you know, our group would not just be 32 members.
what kind of things are they advocating for?
Oh, look, I think again, generally they've moved with the time. So Hickey
Mm.
again has a new book out with a kind of ABC journalist, again, like a very funny guy, but you know, another older white man, about how to look after your mental health, and that can be really good for my dad, for instance, who's not really interested, I don't think, in looking after his mental health anyway. So I think there's some level of they've moved with the times, and they say all of the things about, yes, you should get more sleep, and you should have a better community, and you should be vulnerable, and you should, you know,
Groundbreaking.
reach
Yep.
out and all those sorts of things. And for those people still really reading books and getting information from books, that's really great. But for many people, we actually get our information and our skill building from social media. And we need to,
Mm.
you know, if we want to give people those skills, we need to meet young people in the spaces that they're in. So,
Yeah, true. I mean, I'm curious particularly about the connections to big pharma, and like I feel as though I have to tread carefully because I maybe have different views to a lot of people in this space on, like, I guess, is it, I don't know if it's overdiagnosis, but like I guess for me personally, I've never felt attracted to seeking out diagnoses for, you know,
mm,
my stuff. And I know that other people have found great comfort in that, but I do think sometimes about the way that, yeah, psychology and well, particularly psychiatry, I suppose, is oriented towards diagnosis and therefore the medication that matches up with the
mm.
diagnosis. And it irks me a bit. Like, I don't know. Yeah.
So there's so much to this. There's like a 4-hour episode just on this, because it's, again, I'd use a kind of duality idea here of two things can be true, that diagnosis can be really, really helpful for you to make
Mm,
sense of your behavior, of your, again, your history, your ways of
yeah.
being, and then to improve upon that. And we now don't really, you know, except in some circumstances, you don't necessarily have to have a formal diagnosis to then improve on your attentional habits. And, you know, spoiler alert here, consuming less short form media will probably help your attentional habits improve.
Mm,
So there's a lot, I guess, especially if we think about ADHD as a very specific diagnosis, very separate then to autism, and then very separate to a sociological banner of neurodivergence, which is not recognized as a medical term. It really is that kind of
mm,
way of helping us understand that while we're all quite different, there's lots of patterns and similarities, and this can help bond us and can help us
yeah.
feel seen and understood and all those sorts of things. So again, then within ADHD, you can have a diagnosis and not take medication. You can take medication to begin with and use a lot of behavioral strategies to support yourself and then pull back on the medication. If you have a child diagnosed with ADHD, that's very different to I got a diagnosis when I was 32. Literally, as I was completing my psych training, a psychiatrist friend of mine that I was working with said something about my ADHD, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, I thought you knew. I thought that was a thing that you, and I was like, oh. And then I went off and, got that looked at and have really explored quite deeply. And, that's again, probably part of my practice is that lived experience and that blend of I'm in this too. I proudly tell my clients I've had the same psychologist for 9 years, and I'm very privileged to have the continuity of care that I can, engage with the same person over that period of time. So, diagnosis is different for everybody, and I think there's a lot of conversation about supporting people to get that diagnosis and who does that diagnosis. Certainly psychologists are waving madly in the background as having lots of skills to be able to do that, and constantly overlooked, right? We go and suddenly give GPs the opportunity to do all of this extra training. There's only 1,000 GPs in New South Wales getting this special training, by the way. But, it really is a question of utility and what do you need that diagnosis for, and how is that going to improve things for you?
Yeah, that's interesting. I know that I think the Greens have been pushing on that, right, to expand ADHD and autism diagnosis with GPs. But is it your view that maybe we'd be better off looking at psychologists or?
Well, I think GPs, first of all, we have a GP shortage as well. I don't know that being able to diagnose autism for a GP is what they're after. They could have become a pediatrician if they were interested in that. And in fact, Medicare already actually does have rebates for autism diagnosis if you're under 7. So there are pathways for early intervention and diagnosis that way. I think generally the workforce that is prepped and ready to go around that is psychologists. And again, even within psychologists, there's generally registered psychs like me and clinically registered. And that's a whole nother kind of industry conversation. But again, I kind of feel like, well, I haven't done that extra level of training and I'm not working with pathological kind of conditions as much as I am for where I'm at. So again, there's lots to unpack even there. Generally though, yes, I think we need to look at workforce regardless of who we're bringing into the conversation. Are there actually people there with the skills and the interest in doing these things?
Yeah, I guess it's a similar conversation maybe to the Greens' other push, which is around giving counsellors and I think peer support workers access to the rebated sessions under a mental health care plan, for example, which does seem like such an obvious thing to look at when people are struggling to get in to see a psych, even with their shitty 10 sessions. Or provisional psychologists.
Provisional psychologists don't get Medicare rebates. So even somebody who's being supervised, by a psych can't actually get those rebates. So that would be, to me, again, a really great place to start.
Yeah. And coming back to that, the question around, diagnosis and medication, because I think I almost conflate the two, particularly when it comes to ADHD, because it does feel as though I see it as an increasing pattern, particularly among my peers, like adults who are thinking, I need to get an ADHD diagnosis and get medication. It's one and the same. Obviously less the case for autism, but that I certainly see that. And I have to admit, it makes me I feel a little bit skeptical of it. And I wonder if we are are there trends, are there stats around, I haven't looked into this, medicating more and perhaps treating less,
Yeah, there's should I use the word explosion? Sometimes I don't like using that word, but there has been a significant increase in diagnosis, and that diagnosis often leads to prescribing rates. So many people, I'd say the majority of people, even in my own circle of friends who are receiving diagnosis, are choosing medication options. And sometimes that's because we haven't had good conversations about the behavioral and cognitive therapeutic skills that we can actually apply. And again, that kind of comes back down to the cost of me sitting with you or taking you through that, or even
Yeah.
a online service and, mental health intervention taking you through that is probably greater than whatever the PBS medication for Vyvanse
True.
or dextroamphetamine is.
Mm.
And I think convenience culture to some degree, and the idea that our brains are broken and need fixing, and this drug will fix our
Yes.
brains. Some of the people that I work with actually come to me after that ADHD diagnosis, maybe 6 months down the track, where they've been taking the medications and they are shocked that their life is not smooth sailing.
Yes. Yeah, so I mean, thinking about over medicating and maybe under treating,
Mhm.
I am curious particularly about maybe antidepressants. You mentioned when I first contacted you about coming on the show, the pathologization of sadness was the
Mhm.
term that you used, and I was very curious to hear more about what that is.
Yeah, I think generally we're kind of at a place where we're talking a lot about things like the decolonization of therapy. We're looking at the impact of, this whole individualist society on, like, we just need to be happy, and we were sold happiness for such a long time, right? That we're now finding it really difficult sometimes to sit with the discomfort, our own discomfort, international and global discomfort, existential crisis of, where the planet is at. And we make it like there's something wrong with us for having a very normal reaction to what's happening around us. And I
Mm.
think this has been something that's happened over a long period of time. Generally, the kind of narratives about happiness and about it's your job to kind of fix yourself and take responsibility for
Yeah.
that, as opposed to how we exist in community and in relationship to other people. So when I, said that to you, I think it then kind of parlays into looking at then how we treat that notion of sadness. And for, the past 20-ish years, it has been with antidepressants and the kind of existence of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors.
Mhm.
I first came to be aware of them in the late 90s when I was reading books about people who were starting to take these, and even a book called Talking Back to Prozac, because there was Prozac Nation and all of these different
Mm.
things. And I was when I was redoing or finishing my psychology at Sydney Uni, I was in a toot. I had a toot buddy called Mark Horowitz. And
Mm.
all these years later, Mark Horowitz has written the Maudsley Deprescribing Guidelines for Antidepressants and Psychiatric Drugs.
Mm.
And we now have a very different and emerging sense of what these drugs do and what they don't do, and some of the side effects and withdrawal effects of when we, I guess for some people, take antidepressants for decades without doing any of that cognitive therapy, or any type of talking therapy that may support, and some of the social prescriptions as well that might
Mm.
actually support us have better mental health. So I guess, yeah, that's another huge one, because it is, a very, very challenging conversation for people who
Yeah.
have real, I'm not discounting the very real mental health issues that people have, but also the kind of narrative that that the drugs work and that there is a serotonin imbalance. I mean, that's one of the big things that Mark and Joanna Moncrief in the UK have sort of disproven, this hypothesis that, happiness is an imbalance of chemicals, and these drugs balance those chemicals out and will make you feel happy, because they don't change the state of the world, and they don't change your relationship to that. I think even Johann Hari's book Lost Connections talks, really well about that. There's lots of books, Sedated and other things that we can pop in the show
Mm.
notes for people who want to kind of delicately unpack that. And that's, again, I say that very, very carefully and delicately, but we do. When we start looking at the research, the research for antidepressants often is for very short-term use, not for use
Yeah.
over years.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I I think that part of the tension comes from when you have someone who is in a really acute kind of psychological state, particularly with suicidality, I think. And that's where I think we're often in situations where we're kind of trying to convince someone maybe to try medication, and a lot of people rightly have real reservations about maybe becoming dependent, or like the effects of onboarding and withdrawal
Mm.
of these kind of drugs, and the side effects that they'll face and that sort of thing. But you're also saying, well, you may literally die without some sort of intervention here. And I find those conversations really difficult, because I also I have real reservations about the way that SSRIs are used at the moment, but I also know they can be life-saving for some
Mhm.
people in some
Yeah.
circumstances.
And they're not going to be life-saving if somebody's suicidal, though, because an SSRI is not going to work overnight to take any of
Mm,
the anxiety away. We do know that they probably take 2 to 3 weeks, if not 4,
mm,
depending on
yeah,
which one you're taking, to actually kind of become bioavailable and do their job.
yeah,
However, prolonged use, when you do try to come off them, many of the side effects look like the symptoms of depression. And that's when it gets
yeah,
really confusing for people, because it's like, well, I tried to come off. And the
yeah.
process by which you come off, Mark has shown, is hyperbolic tapering. So coming down by 10%. So if you're on a 10 milligram tablet, you come down by 10%, then 10%, then 10%. That's very little chopping of,
It's very
tablets
hard
into
to,
bits.
yeah.
But then you're off to a compounding chemist to get it liquefied and to do all of these sorts of things. And
No
Mark
one's doing
has
that.
his own lived experience of doing that, that he,
Wow.
now is trying to advocate for companies making these drugs in tiny molecules, so that you can
Mm,
actually come back down. And again, yeah, no one's doing that. And that's why when you come off too quickly, many people get terrible
yeah,
side effects and then give up, because of how, like, that in itself is really a tricky process of trying to take medication. I even recently have my own, again, happy to disclose my own experience of going to a GP for symptoms of perimenopause, most of which were cognitive. And we know that,
mm,
women with perimenopause and ADHD, perfect storm. I was offered a SSRI.
mm.
Now, I was the wrong person for that poor GP to offer that
Oh, the
to.
poor, yeah, I was
And
going to say poor GP.
and I had some very real questions about how inhibiting serotonin uptake was going to affect my plummeting estrogen levels. So
Yeah.
that just seems to be a go-to, because, again, and I go back to the capability kind of thing. GPs have so much on their plate. I have a close family member and several of my friends who are GPs, and it is, yeah, really epic, the amount of stuff they have to be across, and I
A
guess mental health.
wild, yeah, like, how is that a specialty? It's so that's it kind of blows my mind whenever I think about this. I'm like, if you do medicine and then you pick a specialty and it's like feet, or like like noses, and then it's like, and then the other specialty, everything.
Everything. Everything, a lot
What?
of a little bit on the surface
Yeah.
level of most things that you can get
Yeah.
really badly wrong if you don't have a deep knowledge of how they connect.
Mm,
Um, yeah, it's a tricky one, and, like, there's no surprises in the fact that there's a GP shortage, especially when,
mm.
again, we look at the economic imperatives of doing a specialization where you can get lots of money to fix other parts of your body.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is a clumsy segue, but speaking of economic imperatives and stuff, the other thing, I think the thing that came up most consistently when we put this call out for chatting about mental health care, and what the problems are, and the thing that came up over and over and again in the messages we received, was that governments will happily fund band-aids but are not talking about prevention. And I think the best way, one of our patrons, Tanya, put this, and she said, most people are suffering from capitalism, not a mental illness. Is that something that you would agree with broadly?
Yes. Yeah, I talk
Yeah.
to a lot of people, especially, women who are like, "Why can't I do everything?" And I'm like, "Because you weren't designed to," you know?
Mhm.
And it's the kind of internalized capitalism of, I'm being lazy by having a
I'm
sick
a
day. I'm
failure.
being
Mm.
lazy by, needing to rest.
Yes.
I see a lot of people who are selling high level kind of performance programs, which really the problem underlying these are, well, I say capitalism and the patriarchy. I mean, if you
Mm,
want to separate things out, for a lot of women it's the idea that we have three full-time jobs and we beat ourselves up about why we
mm.
can't have it all and do it all. We only have 24 hours in the day, and unlike Beyonce, we probably have to fold our own washing and do all of those other things that people with more resources can outsource. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And we're living in an extremely unstable and insecure world and economy. You know, we had this one message from a psychologist, Tom, and I'm just going to read it out because I think he puts it really well. So he said, extra mental health support doesn't help much if you don't know when your next meal will be, or if you're facing a rent increase you can't cop. The main issue with the model we have is that it places mental illness as a fault within the individual that needs to be fixed, rather than pretty understandable responses to modern capitalism. Why shouldn't we all be depressed and anxious? And I start to wonder, you know, we can do, and I wonder if this is particularly hard when your daily life is about trying to help people, but you know at the end of the day that you can't fix the world that they're kind of going back into.
Mm.
Like, how do we do an effective mental health care system under capitalism?
I wish I knew. I mean, I think that's why my own personal frustrations at the end of last year, I decided to run for the
Yeah.
Greens. Like that was my personal mental health kind of quest. And when I told my psychologist, she was like, I love that for you. Many people were actually very, supportive. I mean, generally, except my
That's
mum.
sweet. Yeah.
Um,
Oh God. Okay. Well, you can talk to your psychologist about that, maybe.
I do, don't worry. Look, it is really tricky, and I think nihilism helps to some degree. Like I
Mm,
think people's own spirituality, their religious beliefs and faith, and all sorts of kind of resources help us get through things. But the biggest resource I think that helps us is actually community and collection, like, collective action.
mm,
Um, being, I mean, what I love, and again, a personal kind of self care or community care process that I do is join climate cafes, which are spaces to talk about your feelings about the climate crisis and the poly crisis. And it's about really connecting with the feeling, not with the action, not with the, okay, we're going to organize this rally and I'm going to make this sign, or I'm going to, make this social media post or letterbox my area or whatever it is. It's actually about just sitting with that, whatever comes up, and in community to watch others do that. And I found personally that when I've done that, the actions I take after it are much more clear and purposeful. So
mm,
there's lots of little ways like that I think we can have these, and it kind of comes from the tradition of yarning circles. I
mm,
know, again, the Shifa Project are running Cafe Palestine and conversations for sitting with feelings about the genocide. And just to be able to have those spaces to go and collectively be together in it rather than scrolling on our phones and feeling quite isolated can be super powerful. A little bit of hope amongst the despair.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think part of me feels a bit resistant to that idea of just sitting in it because I really do subscribe to the belief that, you know, the best antidote to despair is action. But I guess maybe what you're saying is that you kind of need to sit with the feeling before you can even act effectively, because at a certain point, as many of us would know, and people listening to this would know, you can act and act and act and act, and you get a bit tired.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful for activists around burnout and to be able to notice where the energy is, where the energy leaks are, about how to take meaningful action by sitting with where your body is pointing you. I am slightly obsessed with it, and you'll probably hear more from me about, how I'm going to, try and use them in local groups and in Western Sydney in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons, there are others that I won't go into on this podcast, but that I first started seeing a psychologist, getting like doing talk therapy, was it was in the wake of the bushfires. And yes, I was having a lot of climate grief. and anxiety. And I think, I mean, it certainly didn't fix it, and I still feel like I need to do things to try and stop us all, burning to death, etc. But it is helpful. But yes, then I come back to, I'm like, but at the end of the day, I think what's galling then perhaps is when the government refuses to acknowledge in all of this, in all of its discussions around mental health care, refuses to acknowledge that maybe the fact that you're cooking the planet is having an impact on people's mental health, particularly young people's mental health. And until, yeah, like that really does feel like the missing piece of a mental health care strategy, because you can fund treatment, not to say that treatment is adequately funded by any means in this country. But even if you do that, if, yeah, people don't have a secure roof over their head, like, good work, access to community, access to the health, like the other healthcare that they need, food, a safe climate, a safe home, particularly as well for kids. This is one of the things that a lot of people pointed out, the impact of domestic and family violence, particularly on young people. Like all of this, that's got to be part of the conversation
Yeah.
around our mental health, because it's our brain, it's our being, it's affected by all of this.
Yeah. And our need for agency and young people's need for agency to feel like they have a say and
Mm,
feel like they are being listened to. I have a philosophy that if you're over 70, you should vote for somebody who is 16 or 17 who are going to miss out on voting by just that little bit, because they're the ones inheriting the planet and the choices of whatever election
mm,
promises we make or break. As we've sort of seen that that age group especially don't have a place. And, I have again another little rant about how society really hates teenagers. We
yeah,
don't want them to be on social media.
and
We
always
will lock
has.
them up, right?
Yeah,
They need
yeah,
a tag. They're smelly. They don't pay tax. They, cost a lot of money. They're either inside on their devices doing nothing, being addicts, or if they go out and
mm,
they hang around in places, they're
hmm,
loitering and they're in
yep,
gangs and
yep,
so it's really hard, I think, to be especially a young male brown teenager.
yes,
That in itself, I think, is a nexus for needing additional support. And again, uh, you know, driven by youth voice, not what I think they need. That's the last, the last thing they probably need is what I think they need. And asking young people, let's have some more basketball rings in places, like that really expensive mental health intervention called exercise, and places to exercise.
yeah,
Especially while we build more and more housing, affordable inverted commas housing, not actually social housing, which is pretty much just living in a box along a train line with no access to community spaces or green spaces.
yeah.
So if we think there's a youth mental health crisis now, wait until there are more high density buildings all over our major cities.
And yeah, fewer parks, fewer, like, there aren't enough skate parks with lighting. There aren't enough. I think about things like, yeah, all ages music venues, things like that. Kids don't, yes, like without those opportunities, what the fuck are kids going to do? And then we say, oh, and also you can't go on social media.
Yeah.
I think you've kind of alluded to this, but given that it's your area of expertise, I
Mhm.
wanted to talk about the kind of, digital wellness and well-being and cyber psychology stuff. What are your thoughts on the government's social media ban for under 16s?
I think it's a very nice way to look like you're caring about young people without doing really anything but waste a bunch of money. Again, because many of the messy middle, like the inverted commas good kids, with
Mm,
parents who are available and have capacity to support them, we'll keep them off social media. Probably are already doing a lot of great things to teach them how to be good digital citizens, right? As dorky
yeah,
as that sounds. It's the marginalized kids, it's the kids with parents who aren't able to sort of engage in parenting in the way we would love them to. And that can look as like something as simple as they're not able to get to the parent teacher interviews, they're not able to
yeah,
participate in the school community. These are the kids who are going to find ways around the ban. And we know within about half an hour of this coming into effect, there'll be many kids who have real needs in those spaces, the need for competence, connection, and control. They will be in there because unless there's some big jump in the technology, it will be pretty easy to hack at this point. At the moment, it's about 85% effective. So you can think if a seatbelt was 85% effective, how you would trust that.
Yeah.
So, I describe it as kind of like the government is committing to build a really tall pool fence. The pool fence is going higher. It's 13, was 13, and if we just observe 13 as the kind of digital age of consent, that would be great. They're building this really high pool fence, but the latch to the pool is still broken. Kids can
Yeah.
still get in there, and we don't fence the digital ocean and the entire internet. So even the idea that the ban is just for logging on. So you'll still be able to watch TikTok just from not logging on. You'll still be able to watch YouTube
Mm.
Shorts that's not logged on. You'll still be able to be in spaces like Roblox, which is not
Yeah.
part of the ban. But is a space that has some real dangers for young people if they haven't been taught the digital swimming lessons to know how to get themselves out of trouble. Just like, in Australia, we have such a great track record of water safety. We can apply
Yeah.
everything we've learned from that to this space so we can kind of, have our social media and
Yeah.
throw it through.
And like, if you're talking about dangers to kids, like drownings, that actually is a really significant risk for kids, but we don't go keep kids out of the water. We
No,
often teach them
and
how to swim.
And we don't stand by the edge of the pool not knowing how to swim generally either, right? And I think as the parents are the digital lifeguards, and many parents are absolutely petrified and have zero interest actually in swimming. I say to parents, what's your kids doing online? Oh, YouTube. I'm like, there's like a gazillion years of content. Like, which content? What are they doing in
Mm,
Roblox? There's 40 million experiences. So I think that's a generational thing as well. But we
mm,
do have such a polemic kind of attitude towards screens. It's like we don't say, oh, go and have your book time over there in the corner. And after 20 minutes, I'm taking the book away. We
mm.
kind of, do that with screen time, and this notion that,
Yeah.
after a certain amount of time, that's enough, as
Yeah.
opposed to like 1 minute of really violent content can really disrupt a kid's, well-being.
Oh, yeah.
And there's lots of
Yeah.
kids doing digitally nutritious stuff, like how did the climate
Mm,
strike happen? How
yeah.
does a lot of, the good stuff happen? It's in those spaces as well. So I have, strong feelings, prove me wrong that somehow it is
Mm,
a panacea, but
sure.
most of people in the space really don't believe it is. And we're really planning to support the kids who, I guess, breach those rules and are swimming in really dangerous kind of shark infested waters as the ban rolls out. And
Yeah. Yeah. What about the flip side of using new technology, like AI to treat
Mhm,
mental health? I think most people have heard about this in not exactly encouraging
mm,
circumstances, hearing about people using ChatGPT as a therapist, and it just like it potentially validating, you know, paranoid
mhm,
delusions or things like
yep,
this. But I know you were saying, for example, you use it in your practice, I guess quite differently.
mhm.
Do you think, like, is it something we should be concerned about or excited about or both, maybe?
It's always both, and it's always about the context, right? So the context of
Mm,
me using a HIPAA compliant, Australian based and developed tool that meets all of the rigorous standards for healthcare technology is really, really different to a young person asking ChatGPT whether or not their life is worth living.
mm,
We know that there are fantastic chatbots. There's Wobot, which was one of the first kind of evidence based mood and kind of mental health youth interventions. Butterfly Foundation has a really great
mm,
chatbot that you can access that will help you unpick whether or not some of the behaviors you might be experiencing and the feelings that you're experiencing around food are pushing you into that kind of really dangerous territory. So
that's
when these
interesting.
tools, and it really helps then. It's kind of like when you make a phone call to a bank and you press one for this or press two for that. It helps us then triage and work out where to direct you to get the right information, because often people finding the right information quickly is a really good first step, rather than feeling like, when you're in distress, that you then have to go around the mulberry bush to find something that actually speaks to you and speaks to
Yeah.
your situation. And I think, again, places like Reach Out do an incredible job at actually meeting young people's needs, because guess what? It's youth centered and youth designed. So
Mm.
it's just about using the tools in the right way. And again, for mental health treatment, there's again lots of platforms that have been, really rigorously tested. There's lots of apps that are rigorously tested. For everyone that is rigorously tested, though, there's probably 1,000 that are sitting there promising the world and actually creating more dangers. So even literacy around whether you can trust apps is really important, because there's nothing to say that, you and I couldn't come up with a really great app right now, and all we have to do is make sure it meets the specs of the App Store. It doesn't
Mm.
actually ask us what are our qualifications for designing an evidence-based intervention. So,
Yeah. Yeah, like the app that you use, for example, to help with note taking for your
mhm,
sessions,
mhm.
does that have a way of ensuring? Because like when you said that, I'm like, wait, is ChatGPT, is OpenAI now just having access to all of your
No,
patients'
no. So
session data?
it's not. It doesn't get sent anywhere. It's in
Yeah.
a platform. You obviously
Mm.
ask permission. I ask permission basically every session. I say, "Hey, the robot's going to help us out today. Are we still okay with that?" Because people can
Yeah.
withdraw consent at any time. You
Yep.
know, it's really about that ongoing conversation to remind people that that's happening. I can't listen back to it. It's not something that I can, then
Mm.
go home and say, "Oh, have a listen to this story."
Yeah,
It's
true. No,
like I
I
have
didn't
so
even
much
think about
time to
that.
do that.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
it really just, I kind of give it a prompt and say, okay, I want you to turn it into, and it's trained up to write notes in a kind of a way that makes me more compliant.
Mm.
I still take some scribbly notes in a session.
Yeah.
So I'll say to clients, I'm still going to scribble stuff down. That's to help me keep track of what I want to suggest or where I want to go next.
Yeah.
And people have access to that whenever they want. They can look at my scribbles, they can look at the notes, they can request all of that.
Yeah,
So
cool.
yeah, it's all very watertight. And I could go on about all the tech specs around it, but I'm sure that, that doesn't make for such great radio.
No, I mean that's interesting though. And the other thing that you were talking about in terms of um, using AI for help seeking, like we had one listener who wrote in, Liam. They're doing a PhD working on whether AI could improve the experience of people who seek help using addiction helplines specifically, and how that might affect their likelihood of then going on to seek further support and further treatment. And yeah, like I think I guess that does make sense in that space, because as you were kind of alluding to, when someone's in, in the situation where they make the decision to reach out for help, it can make such a big difference what their experience is in that moment. Because you can, if you don't get what you want, like if you're like, okay, fine, I'm getting up the courage, I'm gonna do it, and then you don't get something that's helpful in, the 5 minutes, it's so like I feel like it's so likely that you then just go, okay, I tried, that's
Yeah,
it.
you've
It's
got a
so
pretty
important.
absolutely. You've got a pretty small window to make that kind of first good impression.
Mm,
And often, the kicker here is often people's mental health crises don't happen 9 to 5 when I may or may not
yes.
actually answer my phone. It's 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
The number of email inquiries I get through at odd times because people are in crisis and they're making that
Mm,
step.
yeah.
If there's something there that accurately listens and has been trained to not just mimic back and kind of be a bit sycophantic and
Yeah.
hallucinate is
Yeah.
really really crucial. The same with I think even your first session or even having discovery calls with a psychologist. I kind of am a really big fan of making sure that I want to talk to the person that I'm going to work with before we meet, just so they can vibe me out. We can they can feel
Mm,
more comfortable. And also, if I am not the right person, which is completely okay, you don't waste
yeah.
that really crucial session, that 10% of your
Yes.
sessions potentially, on somebody that isn't quite right.
Yeah.
So
Oh my
if
god.
you're looking for a psychologist, ask for a discovery session. stalk them a
Mm.
little bit online. I also won't work with young people who aren't ready to work with me.
Mm.
So you can lead a teenager to therapy, but you can't make them talk.
Yeah.
And I will just say the door is like metaphorically open for you to come back when you're ready. This is kind of how I roll. And, you might not be ready. And that's, probably speaking to the 19-year-old me who went to a psychologist and was asked about my father. And I was like, yeah, goodbye. And
Yeah.
it took me a long time to circle back to saying, oh, yeah, maybe it is about my father or
I
mother or
mean,
whatever, right?
yeah, yeah. Oh, I had a similar experience where, yeah, I sought out therapy when I was younger and had a really, really did not like the therapist, and then was like, okay, I give up, and it took me years to go back. And we actually had a listener, David, who wrote in about this as well. He's talking about his experience, and particularly, yes, that limitation of the 10 sessions that you get on Medicare, and the fact that there's really so little room to work out fit. And it is so important in this space to have a good fit with your practitioners. Um, but yeah, the fact is, like, it could take you a few sessions maybe to figure out if it's a good fit. And then if you've got 10 sessions and you're like, fuck, now I've only got 7 left, like,
Got to start
it's,
again. It's
yeah.
like dating, right? It's like,
Yeah,
oh, now I
so
have to
true.
start from the story again.
Mm,
Absolutely. And, again, to go back to the stuff about headspace, you often don't get an opportunity to have any sort of consumer choice around the practitioner you are getting when you rock up to
mm,
headspace. You may get somebody who of the gender that you would prefer, and we all have
yeah.
different preferences around that, again, depending on the conversations that we're going to have. So, yeah, check out like psychs that might offer discovery sessions.
It's a good tip. Good
Mm.
psych tip. Well, I think we're almost out of time, but I guess before we go, because this is a podcast about green politics in
Mhm.
Australia, and I mean, I think the Greens' flagship mental health policy leading it up to the federal election certainly was around making it universally available under Medicare, removing that limit, the fucked 10 session limit, higher rebates, and like we were talking about, including registered counselors, mental health nurses. They have a few other policy points. Like, I actually, when I went and looked at it, I was like, oh, this is pretty comprehensive. Is there anything though that you think was like missing from there that you look at and you go, this is what a political party or a government should be adopting policy wise, that's really not being talked about in the mental health policy space?
I don't think directly, because I go back to the section of our conversation where it's about our lives. It's not just about our
Mm,
mental health as something that's completely separate to our financial well-being or our job stability or the I don't know, lack of racism in a workplace, for instance. So I would actually, and something that I was super proud of as a candidate was how many fantastic policies we had, which really interconnected. And before I was a psychologist, I was a social scientist. And I could imagine that these things actually make you not need a psychologist and not
mm,
need that same independence. Again, not necessarily or discounting, mental illness and really significant trauma and all of those other things, but
mm.
some of the things that Headspace speak to, maybe we could actually address with those social prescriptions, like having green spaces and stable housing and your rent not
Yes.
going up randomly, those sorts of things I think really underpin our mental well-being.
Yeah, I mean, I guess obviously we're going to say this as two greenies, but I guess that you said that you were doing this work as a psychologist, and then thought, actually maybe I want to try and fix the underlying issues too, and that's why you ran as a Greens candidate. And if we're looking at, yes, parties that are actually looking at the root causes of this, the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a very few and very few big corporations, while housing is privatized, outsourced, and unaffordable. The climate is cooked. We're approving new coal and gas. All of these things that are not helping anyone's mental health. And I think that's the thing. Yeah, I too feel proud to be like, yeah, I'm a Greens member. That not only do they want to make mental health care free, but they might make it so that I don't need to go and talk to someone for hours about how scared I am for the future that my siblings are, growing up with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a tricky one too, as a psychologist, sort of coming out as a green, because kind of can't put that back into the closet. And
Mm.
interestingly, even in our electorate, while there were 9 candidates, 3 of us were APRA registered professions, and
Oh,
so there is like a big professional risk that you take, and I can take that because I do work for myself, and I got to the point where I was just really willing to own it. If anyone doesn't want to see me because of my politics, i.e., my
mm.
humanity, then that was a really good way of working out, am I somebody who you want to
Good
work with?
filter.
There's
Yeah.
the discovery call, right? So,
Mm.
but, I did get some criticism around that. Not as much as I thought, actually, but even within psychology circles, the idea of recognizing a genocide, man, that blows up in some Facebook
Yeah.
groups still,
Deeply
so
ironic.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because looking at pictures of, babies in hospital beds every day on our screens is doing nothing to our mental health, I'm sure.
No. No.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm.
That's again just another, how do we maintain our engagement with the story? And the story is Gaza and Palestine, not, CEOs at a Coldplay concert,
Mm.
while not actually really fucking our mental health over even further. So it's that very delicate dance. I have a project called Meta, well, zero to do with that meta, more about metaversal.
Mm.
And we do little kind of gatherings where we're really trying to support people find that balance within themselves to stay engaged with the right sources of quality content, while knowing how to give themselves and their brain some space from just how much information we consume. Something
Mm.
like, somebody in Shakespeare's time consumed as much information in their life as we do in a day.
What?
So let you sit with that one. I mean, obviously they didn't have the life expectancy that we have, but
Oh,
the sources of information was like the town crier and the Bible
yeah.
and like the
Wow.
king or whatever, the
That's
priest.
wild.
So
That's wild.
yeah,
Mm.
be
So
kind to your mind.
where can people kind of keep up with what you're working on, find some of
Mhm.
these resources?
Unsurprisingly, I have an Instagram account, the Jocelyn Brewer, will then direct you out to all of the other multi-passionate, all-rounder things that I do, including Greens for Watson. Might see you in 2028.
Ooh, I hope we do. I hope we do. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Jocelyn, and allowing me to just randomly traverse a million ambiguous areas of mental health care policy. But I really enjoyed it, so thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the invite.
And thank you to you, dear Patreon subscriber, listener. Our show is 100% listener funded, so you are the reason that we can keep it running. We pay Mike's wages, and we love you for it. If you do want to help us even more, please tell a friend about the show or share our clips on social media. So we're at Serious Danger AU on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Until next time, bye bye.
Serious Danger Australia.